I was forced into retirement after 40 years of listening for what mattered. I learned how to separate noise from signal the hard way, by watching 1,000 false alarms eat away at careers, relationships, sleep, and by learning how to be patient enough to wait for meaning. So when I tell you the first thing I saw from the future, understand that I know how improbable words stack up. I know how often our instruments lie. I also know what a timestamp is supposed to mean, a footnote in time, not a promise. The file arrived on a Tuesday afternoon. General Markx called me at 15:12 and said in his way that he had little time for mythology. He said the waveform was anomalous, and that the lab was humming with people who hadn't slept properly in 48 hours. He said the header listed a collection code from a program none of us were supposed to talk about over coffee anymore. And then quietly he said a single line that made the room tilt under my feet. The capture was stamped March 14th, 2026, 03:47 GMT. I stared at the log entry as if it were a joke scrawled in someone else's handwriting. The file header should have been a straightforward sequence: capture timestamp, local receipt time, metadata, error bounds. That's how you validate anything in signal work. But this one gave the future as if clerical staff had been handed a pen from a later year. The lab air cooled. Everyone had the same reflex: check the clock, check the system, check their own pulse. The first test was a sanity check. We replayed the waveform through every filter we had: analog to digital, wideband to narrow, matched to known spectral signatures. The pattern persisted. It wasn't just noise. It had the tissue of a deliberately shaped signal, amplitude modulations that looked like a voice print, micro-oscillations more akin to a breathing organism than to a transmitter, frequency components that phased in and out in a way that refused simple Fourier decomposition. In plain terms, it behaved like information. When the analysts set up the output on a monitor, and I leaned close, something else happened. The waveform's envelope, a thin, ghostly line that traced its loudness over time, shifted as I thought about a sequence from my past. Not a coincidence, not a trick of the eye. The envelope responded. You could see it move before my brain finished the image. It was subtle, a hair's breadth change in the timing of a microspike, but it was repeatable. I tried to replicate the effect. I pictured a chair, a childhood streetlight, a particular song I couldn't name aloud. The waveform stuttered, found a different micro-pattern, then resumed its original cadence. The room felt simultaneously very small and very large. We documented everything. We logged my mental images as metadata: time, content notation, the monitor feed. Jenkins, the junior analyst, took notes in a hand that went from neat to ragged in the course of the day. Dr. Ellen Vance asked questions that weren't about signals but about me, my sleep, my stress, my recent medication. She asked them carefully, clinically. That's what psychologists do when their world collides with instruments. Make sure people aren't instruments themselves. The reaction to thought became our first hard conviction and our first liability. If a waveform could respond to human intention, it meant that the boundary we trusted between observer and observed was porous. It also meant that whatever we were looking at answered in a language we hadn't anticipated. Not words, not instructions, but the dynamics of attention. I am an engineer by temperament. The first several days were protocols, masked sessions where the operators didn't speak, where my eyes were closed, and a randomized imagery list was presented to me by a voice in the next room. The waveform shifted in time with the items on the list, only when I gave attention. When an operator tried to mimic my pattern without my presence, nothing happened. When Jenkins tried, the envelope barely budged. It was not simple suggestion. It looked like interaction. Once you have repeated a result, you turn toward interpretation, and interpretation is where we began to split. Marx wanted containment. Rightly so. Any hint that something could influence human cognition becomes a matter of safety. He ordered the facility closed to the public and the project put on watch. He used words like protocols and isolation. Dr. Vance advocated for humane boundaries, no coercion, clear consent, medical oversight. Jenkins got a leave and told us in an over-caffeinated moment that it felt like a music only some of us could hear. Synchronicity started as a joke and then stopped being funny. I thought of Markx, the man whose betrayal had ended my short-lived marriage and who I had not spoken to in 8 years, and the phone in my pocket rang with his name on it. I told myself that any coincidence could be teased apart with probability, but when my daughter, in the living room that evening, described a dream in which a clock kept flipping to 03:47 because it felt right to her, the rational scaffolding got shaky. She's 8. Kids dream with the blunt honesty of unfiltered pattern recognition. She told me, in a voice that liked the sound of the stars, that the dream felt like someone was knocking, but not hard. We began to find objects left as if by a hand that knew things beyond us. The first was a Polaroid slipped under Jenkins' lab door at 02:09 on Friday. It was old, its white border stained a little and the image slightly faded, but the picture showed the lab's southern window as it looked today. On the lower border, someone had scrawled a date in a hand that was not Jenkins, 11/03/2026. The film chemistry on that print was consistent with a Polaroid made in the mid-1980s. The technicians ran a spectral analysis and dated the emulsion profile. It was, in their words, an authenticated anomaly, a photo with the patina of age that referenced a future moment. Objects of this kind are what anthropology calls indexical. They point to a maker and a place. They make claims without using language. The Polaroid made a claim. The future referenced the present. We stapled the printout into the project binder next to the waveform logs and wrote the word artifact on its page. Someone, somewhere, had an interest in handing us proof that time's arrow was not so unilateral as we assumed. Then the archive search began in earnest. The program's historical cache, redacted and brittle, yielded little at first. Then, in a folder labeled only with an old project number, I found the skeleton of a pattern. Photographs and notes made in quiet labs described capture events and alleged subsequent real-world phenomena. Dates clinked together in a way that was hard to dismiss: 1967, 1983. Another file noted captures in 1982 that linked forward to 1999. The later file referenced 1999 recordings that correlated with strange social spikes in 2012. Each arrow wasn't a prediction so much as an after-the-fact annotation. Someone, at an earlier time, had recorded a signal that seemed to anticipate or correlate with a later convergence in social behavior. Convergence, the word appeared often, not as a prophecy but as an operational term used by people who'd been doing this work long enough to name patterns. Convergence in those notes was the moment when many possible probabilities collapsed toward a narrower set of outcomes. The files didn't claim cause and effect. They suggested a dynamic, fields of attention aligning and thereby making some possibilities more likely than others. Where those archives were precise, they were also sketchy, raffled by security protocols and by people who wrote with hedging and disclaimers. They listed dates, outcomes, and a deadpan admission that the effect, whatever it was, tended to recede when monitored aggressively. Reading those files, I felt the weight of lineage. The idea that we were part of a chain of observation and self-observation changed the moral geometry of the project. If previous convergences, 1967, 1983, 1982, 1999, 1999, 2012, left vague fingerprints on culture, then what we were seeing might be the next in a line. The files pointed with a steadiness that looked like ritual to a coming point. March 14, 2026, 03:47 GMT. The pattern suggested this was not random but possibly cyclical. The phrase possible collapse event kept showing up, bracketed by operational caution. No one had, in those folded notes, used words like salvation or doom. People who study systems become very conservative with metaphors. The downloaded hypothesis, the one I will be careful to label as my interpretation of what was given to me, is simple in form, but monstrous in consequence. It proposes that consciousness exists as a kind of state frequency. Attention in aggregate modulates a field. The state of that field influences which probabilities in a given system collapse into realized events. In non-technical terms, our collective mind state nudges the course of possibility. Convergences are moments when small nudges can cascade because uncertainty in the system is already low, and the architecture of attention amplifies the nudges. When I first received that understanding, if received is the right word, it did not arrive in sentences. It arrived as geometry. There was an internal sense of resonance, like plucking a string inside the skull, that mapped to an image of many overlapping waves folding into a singular crest. It felt like hearing a chord that denoted an instrument you had not known existed. The download did not claim the existence of outside beings offering salvation. It claimed to describe mechanism, frequency, field, collapse. The ethical residue was immediate. If the hypothesis held any water, then our choices mattered at scales we rarely considered, and there would be moments when the cumulative tone of millions of minds could produce a tangible steer. We took this revelation through every filter of institutional skepticism. I insisted, often against my own growing feelings, that we document the phenomenon as if we had to explain it to a jury of physicists. We invented experiments that would minimize expectation and maximize blind controls. We asked strangers to the project to present images at random, to think of abstract geometric shapes rather than concrete memories. The waveform responded best not to content, but to intensity and steadiness of attention. Quick flashes did little. Sustained states, calm, intentional, enduring focus, left the clearest ripples on the envelope. Containment became a looming moral question. If attention mattered, then even secrecy could seed outcomes. Retaining information to avoid contagion risked creating a small, intense focus unlikely to disperse but potent in its locality. Releasing information risked panic, religiosity, and exploitation. Marx's answer was military caution and compartmentalization. Dr. Vance's answer was to open a measured, therapeutic route for people to process what they were experiencing. I found myself between them, the old analyst who wanted precision, and the man who had watched his daughter sleep and had seen her dream of clocks. It was not a comfortable place. The psychological cost showed up in Jenkins. He was a good kid, quick, hungry, with more curiosity than sense, and he took notes like he feared forgetting anything sacred. He was the first to report sustained visual afterimages he could not scrub from memory. Geometric tapestries in the dark, the feeling of a hand brushing his forearm when no one was present. He told us that sometimes, in the corridor, his shadow lagged a half-second behind him, like evidence that time had become sticky. We treated him with respect. We brought in psychiatric evaluation as a protocol. We gave him space. He had an episode during an evening test. Screaming images pressed through his words and then a hush that made everyone in the room stop breathing. He was taken to a clinical wing for observation, and the records read with the clinical restraint of people who know how to name danger without stigmatizing. Dr. Vance wrote that an abundance of caution was needed. We began to provide resources and to insist that no one go through the perceptual shifts alone. Synchronicity scaled like a rumor, at first localized, then threadbare across systems. Newsrooms caught a whiff of the unusual. Independent reports of identical dreams, of strangers finding the same old photograph tucked beneath their windshields, of servers spitting out timestamps that referred to future events. These were scattered and noisy. They resisted being corralled into a single narrative. But pattern-seeking is built into us. We are statistical animals dressed up in story. The archive drew lines, the artifacts supported them. The Polaroids kept appearing, sometimes in envelopes with a note in a hurried hand. You resist a lot. Printouts would be left on desks that read in crisp block letters, "Convergence confirmed." They were quick, blunt messages that sounded less like prophecy and more like a field report. I want to emphasize this. Every artifact we recovered carried the tone of a messenger who expected us to do the work of interpretation. The items were not instructing us to act. They were pointing. That difference mattered. It kept the narrative inside the domain of invitation and away from the theatrics of command. We began to run distributed experiments. Volunteers in urban centers received a text in the morning asking them to sit for 10 minutes and hold a steady state of calm focus on a neutral image, nothing religious, nothing prescriptive, while a server logged electromagnetic readings in local areas. We asked them to report subjective experience. Results were messy, as real human systems are. Some reported nothing. Some reported a surge of meaning. Some said their neighbor called unexpectedly with a story that echoed their own thoughts. When the aggregate data was run against background noise, small correlations emerged. Not proofs, but nudges on the map. The timing of these nudges pointed us, again and again, toward moments of alignment that had low entropy, and thus were more susceptible to influence. Dawn and the dead of night, times when the human brain is not so burdened by incoming tasks. Markx did not like the idea of a public experiment, but he could not deny the ethics of controlled exposure. If attention had consequences, then exposing people without consent had liability as well. Dr. Vance insisted on informed consent and a strict medical safety protocol. We worked in the margin between curiosity and duty. It was in that interval that I began to see the work not just as data, but as a kind of stewardship. The downloaded geometry kept returning. Frequency, field, collapse. It told a story that didn't absolve us. Observers, those entities we had no name for beyond they or them, did not come with a rubric of salvation. They showed possibilities and, more importantly, the mechanism by which possibility could be chosen. That distinction was the moral axis on which I turned at night. If someone hands you the map with no keys, you still have to choose where to step. Not everyone agreed with my measured stance. Outside voices wanted certainty, sensationalism, or to weaponize whatever this was. Inside the facility, debates flared. The more we learned, the more we discovered that knowledge itself had a habit of creating resistance. People are built to fear unknown leverage over them. Institutions are built to remove leverage. Our confidential channels shorted out as rumors found their way through the human network. And then the mirror arrived. Someone slid a small, antique hand mirror under the door to the lab at Euro 112 on a slow Saturday. The glass rim was worn, and the back had a chip of gilding that caught the light when it moved. On the mirror's face, pushed gently into the silver, was a thin strip of paper showing a countdown printed in a typeface that looked deliberately old-fashioned. Days, hours, minutes. The lower edge of the strip bore the words "Convergence Confirmed," printed in a way that suggested it had come from a typewriter rather than a laser printer. Under the countdown, someone had attached a small Polaroid with slightly smudged edges. The photo was of a cup on our lab bench with a tremor-induced pattern of concentric water ripples. Someone had taken the picture minutes before, and then aged it to look older. Yet chemical dating showed it had a real film profile consistent with an older stock. It was an impossible layering of present and past technique. On the reverse of the mirror's frame, scrawled in pen that had been pressed hard, were 3 words. You resist a lot. It was the same blunt note pattern we had seen elsewhere. Whoever left it expected resistance. That single judgment, you resist a lot, felt like a challenge. It felt like a clinical statement made by someone who had observed our institutional reflexes and was gently, insistently pushing us toward a question we had avoided. What if the resistance itself was the lever? I kept the mirror in my office for a day. I had it on the desk between a stack of signal reports and a mug that read, "I heart spectrograms." The countdown read 48 hours. The numbers ticked down like a heart monitor. I turned the mirror to look at myself and then shut the lid and pretended it was nothing. Pretending lasted as long as pretending holds when a man knows his child dreamed a clock. People around me began to exhibit small changes, microshifts that felt like being slightly out of phase with one's own life. A technician misremembered a meeting time and instead walked into a cafe where someone they'd lost contact with sat nursing a coffee. An offhand reference in a server log led to an old research paper that had been long buried. Coincidence doesn't scale, but pattern-looking minds do. We are, as a species, wired to assemble myths out of stray sticks. The difficulty is telling myth from map. At night, I woke with the cord at the base of my skull, that internal resonance that first gave the geometry of collapse. It was not pleasant nor entirely peaceful. If I closed my eyes and tried to steady my attention on the breath, the internal image would fold into the sound of a tapped frequency. The download didn't tell me what to do next. It gave me a condition. It said, attention moves probability, fields respond to steady states. Convergences are moments when outcomes narrow. The imperative was ours. The moral work, deciding how to live under that knowledge, was unoffered and therefore heavier. I began to record behaviors that steadied me. I walked to the corner store instead of driving. I paid attention to the clerk's hands as they scanned my bread. I let the stopwatch on my phone time 3 steady breaths before I lifted my daughter from the couch. These were small acts. I'd seen similar things in the files, people who cultivated small daily states of consistent attention and then reported months later that their lives took on a different texture. The archived notes were not heavy on prescriptive practice. Their authors had been more interested in pattern recognition than in giving people step-by-step manuals. Still, small habits kept recurring. Presence, repetition, non-reactivity. The artifacts suggested practice. They never promised results. We had a theory, a town of small experiments, a mounting litany of artifacts, and a mirror with a countdown. The word convergence sat like a fulcrum under the chair we were all sharing. March 14, 2026, 03:47. GMT glinted at the edge of our perception like a lighthouse. It felt near enough to touch and far enough to haunt. I do not tell you this to frighten you. Fear is a useful reaction, but a poor teacher. I tell you this because the story, if it is a story at all and not a confession, begins with a question that will keep repopulating itself. What do you do when a mechanism reveals that your inner states have consequences that potentially scale beyond the private? What do you do when someone gives you the map without the compass? At the facility, we debated whether to release the Polaroid data in a controlled way to the wider scientific community or to lock it away. We argued about whether sharing the mirror's countdown would create the very intensity we feared. Dr. Vance suggested an alternative, an invitation rather than a leak. She wanted to offer a space, a neutral digital room where people could come and practice presence as an experiment. Not a ceremony, not a cure. A simple place to cultivate steadiness, log subjective experience, and have a medical line available if perceptions change too quickly. The proposal read conservative and humane. Markx read it and folded the paper back over with his thumb. He said slowly that the problem with invitations is that they might be inadvertently coercive in the sense that they would create a concentrated attentional state. His mouth was tight. His worry was that we would, by trying to prevent contagion, manufacture it. We compromised. We launched a soft-closed study. A couple hundred volunteers agreed to sit for 10 minutes daily, eyes open, focusing on a neutral image. They logged sensations and we collected environmental data with shielded sensors. The first week, results were noise. The second week, a small fraction reported steady feelings of clarity. A handful of reports contained coincidences so uncanny, old friends reappearing, photographs found in impossible places, that the team fell silent while we tried to measure if silence had weight. I will tell you something else now that may feel strange. When I'm asked to name my belief, I hedge. I do not claim knowledge. I claim experience and a stubborn curiosity. The download that made me speak of frequency and collapse was not a sermon, and it did not hand me a manual. It gave me pattern. Perhaps the field metaphors are poetic, a mind's attempt to map the unknowable. Perhaps they are close enough to be actionable. On the night the mirror arrived, a printout landed on my desk. It read, in a clear, clipped font, "You resist a lot." I stared at the words until the paper blurred. The same sentence had been on the mirror's frame. Someone who had watched us had judged our institution's reflex to avoid, to compartmentalize, as resistance. It was a useful accusation. It forced us to ask whether our default position, protect and isolate, was actually the best way forward when the mechanism might respond to seeding. The countdown ticked lower. The Polaroids kept arriving. The waveform persisted in strange ways, responding less to quick images than to long-held collective tone. I found myself increasingly wary of words like prediction and destiny. The archive's arrows, 1967, 1983, 1982, 1999, 1999, 2012, did not point to inevitability. They pointed to history. Patterns repeat when conditions recur. Perhaps this was a place where conditions were aligning again. The team gathered for a meeting that lasted long into the night, and at the table we were less a set of professionals than a cluster of people who had seen the same ghost. Markx spoke about containment. Dr. Vance spoke about care. Jenkins was in his cot across the hall and could not attend. Someone from security, an older woman named Reyes, who had watched classified doors close in front of her long enough to have calluses on her patients, folded her hands and said simply that the easiest thing to do would be to ignore the artifacts and wait for the world to settle. I looked at her and thought she was wrong, and not wrong at the same time. Ignoring a lever does not neutralize it. It lets it shape things in ways you cannot see. We decided to be present at the point the countdown reached 0. The reasons were not purely scientific. There was an ethic to presence. If fields respond to attention, then choosing to be with the event, choosing to hold a steady, quiet tone, might be a way to act without coercion. It was a small kind of courage and a small way to shoulder responsibility. We would not attempt to force outcomes. We would not claim to speak for anyone else. We would be witnesses and steadiers. We would be open to whatever the moment offered. I packed my bag with small, ordinary things: a notebook, a pen, a worn copy of a book of poems that had nothing to do with physics, and a Polaroid camera that had once belonged to an archivist who liked analog tangibility. I thought of my daughter and tried to be brave on her behalf. On the evening before March 14th, the facility felt tight with anticipation. The mirror on my desk read 20 hours. The Polaroid I'd taken earlier showed the cup with concentric ripples and dated the image in a small, shaky hand. 0314 to 2026. The paradox felt less like a puzzle and more like a summons. I cannot finish this account with a neat bow. The thing that first drew me in, the waveform stamped March 14th, 2026, 0347 GMT, still glows in my memory like an ember under ash. We did not know if that timestamp was a warning, an offer, or merely a location marker. We did not know if the observers who had been leaving us objects wanted us to act. We only knew that resistance might be the thing that kept us from waking up to our small, consequential choices. There is a moment in the thin hours before a marked event when memory and possibility seem to breathe together. I sat by the mirror and tried to steady my pulse. Outside, the world continued in its unknowing way: cars, light, a neighbor calling her dog. Inside, the air felt charged. The countdown read 12 hours. There was time to decide whether to be present or to hide behind protocols. There was time to choose how we would meet whatever came next. I folded my hands over the mirror, and in that gesture I felt the old pull of responsibility, an engineering ethic, an ethical humility that said, "Do no harm, but do not hide." The waveform hummed in the next room, patient as a cathedral organ. The date on the Polaroid's margin blinked like a message from a stranger who trusted us enough to leave a clue. The clock in my office winked toward midnight, and for a while I let myself simply sit in the feeling between fear and wonder, because the two seemed to live in the same house. If you are still here, and the beginning of this story is moving something in you, I ask one small favor. As you listen, notice the state you are in. Observe your heart rate, the tension in your hands, the steadiness of your breath. This is not an instruction to do anything grand. It is a simple practice of noticing. Nothing more, nothing less. Be with your attention for a minute. See what changes when you allow that small observation. We were on the edge of a moment whose map we had only begun to sketch. The mirror's countdown kept pulsing. and people who had nothing to gain were beginning to arrive in the facility. Neighbors, a former colleague, a woman who said she'd found an old Polaroid in a second-hand bookshop that showed a bus stop with a time scribbled in pencil. Row 347. The evidence had a rhythm, artifacts pointing to a time, small subjective reports of shifted perception, an archive that hinted at cycles, and a waveform that answered the steady attention of those who knew how to keep their minds quiet. I withdrew the Polaroid I had taken of the cup and smoothed its edge with a thumb. On the back, someone had printed, in neat capitals, the words we had started to see elsewhere. You resist a lot. It was not an accusation as much as a diagnosis. The mirror's countdown ticked lower still. Then someone knocked at my office door. Someone knocked at the door. I expected Reyes. She kept the perimeter tight and the passes tidy, but the hand that slid the latch open belonged to someone I had not seen in years. It was Sarah. She looked as if she had walked through several versions of her own life to get here. The hair she kept short now, a jacket folded across her arm, the look of someone who had learned there are things you cannot plan for and must simply meet. She did not need to explain why she was there. Her presence was another of those small, improbable alignments that had become the weather. In her hand she held a cheap digital camera with a Polaroid still tucked into the slot. A new Polaroid, but the picture's edge was smudged as if it had been handled by someone who expected fingerprints to tell a story. The image showed a bus stop bench with a scrap of paper pinned beneath it. Someone had written AO 347 on that scrap. Sarah set the photo on my desk without a word. We both knew what it meant. People began to arrive in waves that night. Not just the team, security carrying sealed packets, technicians with boards of monitors, Dr. Ellen Vance with a medical kit and a patient's compassion, but neighbors who had slipped through rumor's seam, volunteers who'd been part of the small closed study, and a few strangers who had simply been in the right place at the right time. The facility's public wing was empty. We had closed most doors to avoid accidental exposure. We built walls of caution even as objects undercut our desire for secrecy. Those who came did so quietly, as if a shared respect had grown between us. No spectacle, only a willingness to be present. Markx arrived later than expected, hands folded and face weathered but set. He carried the posture of a man for whom containment had been both an instinct and a career. He did not smile. He did not need to. He sat at the table like a judge awaiting testimony. Still, when the mirror's countdown ticked to single digits and the room's chatter thinned to a hum, he found a chair and breathed, as if to test whether his own steadiness would hold. Jenkins was not there. I had hoped he would be, if only because I wanted to see recovery rather than the permanent imprint of a crisis. His absence felt like a missing frequency in a chord. The clinical wing had been careful with him. He'd had an episode that left the staff prudent and the team raw. Protocols required distance, rest, and measured returns. That distance had the unfortunate effect of making his absence loom. We could not pretend it was small. The field we were dealing with was not indifferent to the vulnerable. We gathered in a deliberately neutral configuration. Chairs set in a loose circle, a single table for devices and analog artifacts, a Polaroid camera, a battered notebook, the small mirror with its strip of typed numbers. No banners, no chants, no scripts. Dr. Vance guided us through a simple consent statement she read aloud. Remain aware of your state. Step back if sensations escalate. Use the clinical line if perception becomes distressing. No one wanted to be surprised into panic. That was the first and last practical rule of the night. Preserve the capacity to step back. Outside the facility, the world did its ordinary business. Ambulances, transit schedules, the hum of servers and distant racks. Inside, time felt like a different thing, the sort of subjective dilatation that comes when a hinge is about to open. It was not dramatic. It was more like the way you notice the room sound when someone stops speaking. Conversation fell away. People settled into small rituals. Someone brought a thermos and passed cups. A volunteer with steady hands placed a neutral image, a gray circle on white paper, in the center of the room. The image meant nothing on its own. It was a place to put attention and nowhere else. We had chosen, deliberately, to hold a steady tone. The download had emphasized that intensity mattered less than duration. Short shocks moved the envelope less than quiet constancy. So we sat. We breathed. We let the room's small noises, wheels, distant HVAC, a pen clicking, be the background against which human attention might hum. The lead-up hours were a study in ordinary human behavior being reconfigured into a practice. Some people watched the mirror's countdown as if the numbers were a heartbeat. Others kept their eyes gently lowered, focusing on the gray circle or the sensation of breath at the base of the throat. A security officer named Heller, who had seen classified doors open and shut more times than he cared to remember, surprised us by keeping his hands visible on his knees as if to remind himself he was still in his own body. Reyes lent her presence like ballast, quiet, watchful, the sort of attention that doesn't demand applause. A few artifacts did something strange that evening. The Polaroid I kept in my pocket, the one of the cup with concentric ripples, seemed to morph under certain light. You could look at it and feel the image settle deeper into its chemicals, as if some latent information tightened its focus. Printouts that had sat inert for days suddenly showed faint new text in margins we had not noticed. The words "Convergence Confirmed" printed elsewhere than their original placements, as if the message was wanting to be legible from more than one angle. None of it looked preposterous on the surface. Rather, it felt like a careful insistence. As Dr. Vance said once, quietly, "The artifacts keep inviting interpretation. Our job is to bear witness without inventing it." At 02:47 GMT, the room's rhythm shifted. The mirror read 1 hour remaining. A new pattern of calls and messages pulsed through a guarded phone line, reports from distant volunteers, emails that simply read, "I see it too." A few stations in the city that never ran midnight features had pre-recorded segments about shared dreams and image coincidences that now crawled across our monitors. Someone in the room, one of the volunteers from the closed study, said she had seen the same geometric pattern in a dream that had hovered above the horizon like a kite. The data was messy and insistently human. Anecdotes mingled with server spikes, and each fed the other. We held a simple set of practices. Dr. Vance asked us to relax the jaw, soften the gaze, and keep the breath even. We were asked explicitly not to conjure images of victory or apocalypse. No dramatic content to lend the field a narrative to latch onto. The idea was to hold a tone, a non-reactive, attentive presence. If the download had been accurate, extreme emotional surges would likely amplify the instrument in unintended directions. We wanted steadiness because steadiness is, paradoxically, one of the rarer human gifts. The minutes dissolved in a way I remember as a texture more than events. There were small human interruptions. Someone stood to fetch water, a phone buzzed and was silenced. But the room kept its thread. I kept watching Marx's hands. He folded the fingers and smoothed his thumb over the knuckle as if counting something invisible. He did not speak much. When someone did speak, they spoke with small words, as if togetherness required frugality. At 03:30 GMT, someone in the back of the room whispered, "Do you feel that?" It was not a question about an external vibration, but about an internal state. A few heads nodded. A warmth, perhaps, or simply the sense that attention had shifted from being an act to being an environment. The waveform in the lab, which had been humming like an organ tuned to a low note, settled as if listening. 03:47 approached with deceptive ordinariness. The mirror's countdown clicked through minutes and seconds. At 30 seconds, the room seemed to draw a collective breath. There were no lights, no alarms, no dramatic flares. It was more like the moment when, in a music hall, a soloist lifts a bow and the orchestra remembers to stop breathing. For me, the experience was both external and deeply private. The topology of the room was the same, but the angles of attention inside every person I could see shifted minutely, as if tiny magnets beneath our skin had aligned. I cannot, in good conscience, paint the night with pyrotechnics. There was no aurora, no otherworldly choir. The event was a pulse, subtle, intimate, and not easily dramatized. It felt like a note struck inside the head that let some internal latch open a fraction. People blinked at once. A few exhaled. Some hands trembled, not with fear, but with the sensation of a shift in equilibrium. A printout on the table, which had been blank in the lower margin, showed text where none had been, faint as a watermark, but legible enough to read, "Convergence confirmed once you leaned in." The Polaroid I had kept in my pocket did something I did not expect. Its image darkened as if more light had been poured onto the emulsion from the inside. Later someone would describe it as the photograph catching its breath. When the pulse happened, what mattered was not spectacle, but distribution. It was as if something non-spatial, the "they" we had been calling them, or the mechanism we had only partially understood, had offered a seam for attention to cross. I had, at the midpoint of this thing, another download. Not a voice, not a set of propositions, but a set of sensations that translated into an idea I could later put into words. The presence did not tell us which choice to make. It only made the menu of possibilities visible in a way that a crowd could notice together. Observers in that moment had not forced an outcome. They had given a clearer field in which choice could be made. After the pulse there was a thick, soft silence. People sat in that silence with the care of those who had been handed something fragile. Someone laughed, too sharp, then ashamed of their relief. Markx closed his eyes and cracked a smile that did not try to explain anything. Dr. Vance moved through the room, checking faces, offering water, providing the clinical reassurance that steadiness required. Outside, distant servers logged an uptick in anomalous packets, and somewhere a small newsroom that had been tracking the rumors cut to a live feed with a commentator who tried and failed to corral meaning into a headline. In the hours that followed, the world did not rewrite itself. Markets did not collapse, governments did not issue emergency mandates, and the sky did not rearrange. The change was quieter and, in a way, harder to notice. A set of small, correlated human choices that favored connection over withdrawal in certain places. A man we had not seen in years called his estranged sister. A woman who had found a Polaroid in a second-hand bookshop chose to leave the bookshop owner a thank-you note and ended with an invitation to coffee. A volunteer who had felt directionless for months reported, with surprise, that she registered a single, clear desire: to return to painting. These were not miracles. They were soft shifts, alterations in the angle of attention that made certain next steps more likely. Jenkins surfaced a day later, in stages. He was cautious, medicated, and under observation, but he sent a message to the team through Dr. Vance that read, simply, "I saw the pattern like a net. I don't know how to be in it yet." That statement, humble and unsettled, felt true to us all. The mechanism we had glimpsed did not come with an instruction manual. It came with an ethical imperative to proceed with care. Institutional response was predictably mixed. Official spokespeople issued statements that emphasized prudence and the need for further study. The facility's higher command insisted on maintaining the watch posture while opening channels to vetted scientific partners. The leaks multiplied, some deliberate, some accidental, and the public conversation roiled between skepticism, curiosity, and fear. That was expected. What none of the official lines could entirely account for was the spread of what I will call the contagion of awareness, small clusters of people who, after that night, reported being more attentive to subtle states within themselves and to the ripples they seemed to create. Some of those clusters did problematic things, grand claims and cultish certainties, but most of them were quietly domestic. People choosing to be less reactive with their children, to listen more, to resist the panic of instant opinion. We continued to collect artifacts. More Polaroids turned up. A bus stop bench with the same scrap of paper, a cafe table bearing a Polaroid of a sugar packet folded into the shape of a small arrow, a photograph developed with a shadow in the lower corner that when magnified looked like a finger pressed against the print. Someone sent us a packet of printouts that had appeared on a government contractor's desk with a single typed line: "You resist a lot." The recurring message was not cruel. It read to me as a diagnostic, a prompt to reflect on institutional reflexes that default to denial, containment, and fear. In the weeks after the convergence, the pattern of small shifts continued. Volunteers who had practiced steadiness reported an increased ability to notice their mood before reacting. Neighborhood exchanges that would normally have dissolved into terse practicality began to include small offers: a cup of sugar, a short conversation, a willingness to wait 5 extra seconds before answering. Human gestures are porous. They bleed into each other. The trickle of gentleness spread like a rumor that some people chose to follow. I do not want to romanticize this. For every neighbor who reconnected, there were stories of people who felt frightened by sudden vivid dreams, and clinics reported a handful of people who requested medical attention for experiences that upset them. We made it a rule to say, always and without exception, if your perceptions become distressing, please talk to a medical professional. Inner work is not a substitute for clinical care. We kept that boundary explicit because some experiences must be handled with the tools of medicine, not mysticism. On the job side, the facility continued to operate under watch. Markx met with oversight panels and argued for methodical study. Dr. Vance set up a follow-up protocol for volunteers that included psychiatric screening and support. We kept Jenkins on a slow path back with medical supervision and the option to withdraw without stigma. The ethics of stewardship demanded both scientific rigor and humane care. We tried to hold the two together, even when holding both felt expensive. I was asked often, in interviews and private conversations, whether the convergence had been caused by our attending. I answered as I was taught to answer in the lab, cautiously. Correlation was there. Causation could not be declared. The downloaded model, attention as a state frequency, modulating a field that biases probability collapse, remained my interpretation based on the thing that had been given to me. It had the humility of a hypothesis, useful, serious, and provisional. It also had ethical teeth. If attention shifted probability even a little, then what we did with that small leverage mattered. The months that followed were a series of small experiments and social negotiations. We published papers that were careful in their language, describing anomalies and procedures rather than pronouncing conclusions. We encouraged other teams to replicate under strict ethics boards. We did not release the Mirror's original strip beyond a small, vetted review committee. Its presence had become almost mythic, and the last thing we wanted to do was to convert artifact into altar. People outside continued to make meaning in 1,000 ways. A podcast host framed the events as proof of extraterrestrial guardianship. A science magazine published a long, skeptical piece that praised our rigor while decrying our small sample sizes. A small group in a distant city began holding nightly presence sessions that blurred into a community practice. The cultural landscape, messy as ever, rearranged itself around this new seam of possibility. There were personal repercussions. My daughter, who had told me of a dream where the clock kept flipping to 03:47, asked me, months later, whether time had been broken or if she had just been special to dream a knock. I told her neither. Both answers felt like stories too tidy. And instead I taught her a small practice, 2 minutes of watching the breath, a way to stabilize a curious child whose mind sometimes ran like a squirrel. She learned to name tension in her shoulders and to notice how saying a kind thing to someone could make her stomach feel warmer. These were not spiritual guarantees. They were ordinary parental tools that, in the context of our work, felt like moral first aid. The pattern archives remained stubbornly ambiguous. The sequence, 1967, 1983, 1982, 1999, 1999, 2012, sat in folders next to our logs and Polaroids. Each link told a story of attention and subsequent cultural movement, but none produced a deterministic engine. Histories repeat because conditions recur. That was perhaps the story's soft moral. When a system has low entropy, when attention is already concentrated, the smallest nudges can cascade in unanticipated ways. Our responsibility was not to control those cascades, but to choose to be the kind of people who favored outcomes that preserved agency, dignity, and the capacity to care. At some point, inevitably, questions about motives rose. Who was leaving the Polaroids? Who had typed, "You resist a lot"? Was it an internal operative, a prankster, or those they who refused to be named? We had no answer. The artifacts had the aura of someone who respected our ambiguity, not arrogant instruction, but an insistence that we look. The mystery of agency remained. It was fitting. If the mechanism was non-spatial, then the way it arranged evidence would not necessarily conform to our instincts about attribution. Months after the event, I found a Polaroid folded into the pages of an old book at a library sale. The photograph showed a street corner I recognized, and someone had written 0347 in pencil on the back. The film looked modern, where the edges were bright and new, yet the handwriting leaned to the left like someone with habits I could not place. I bought the book, folded the Polaroid into my pocket, and walked home through ordinary Thursday traffic feeling, for a moment, like a person carrying an impossible secret. Life is largely made of such small paradoxes, the normal and the uncanny braided tightly together. There were, of course, attempts at exploitation. Coaches and self-styled gurus promised quick ascents into a new state of being. Online marketplaces filled with dubious devices. We published a short guidance note then. Our work did not endorse programs claiming guaranteed awakening or miraculous cures. We emphasized a basic truth. Practices that cultivate steady attention are exercises in self-regulation and care, not shortcuts to supernatural outcomes. The ethical boundary was necessary because attention, like any human capacity, can be commodified. We resisted that tendency as best we could. As a consequence of that resistance, and because I had been intimately involved in the events, I spent more time away from the lab than I expected. I wrote and spoke cautiously. I met privately with small groups who wanted to explore steady practice with guidance and clinical oversight. The format was simple. Short guided sessions focused on noticing states paired with journaling and a medical safety line. We framed them explicitly as non-therapeutic skill building and made clinical referrals when necessary. People reported modest benefits, reduced reactivity, clearer decision-making, a modest increase in patience. Those are small goods, but in the aggregate, small goods shift a neighborhood, and if repeated widely, have the possibility to nudge broader outcomes. The question still hangs. Did 2026's message revolutionize our world? It would be dishonest to claim that the globe turned on a dime. Institutional inertia is thick, and people are complicated. But some things changed. The conversation about attention, responsibility, and the ethics of observation entered new spaces: boardrooms, classrooms, and hospital rounds. Some researchers began to study long-duration attention as a variable in social systems. Activists used the idea of intentional attention as a metaphor for sustained civic engagement. Artists painted the geometry of the downloads and used them as scaffolding for performances that invited audiences to sit in shared attention. The word convergence took on a public life, sometimes used carefully, sometimes used as a slogan. For me, the event made ethics practical in a new way. If attention could bias outcomes even a little, then the daily question of how to be in the world suddenly felt more consequential. It is one thing to believe your actions matter. It is another to recognize that the qualities of your attention, steady, frightened, generous, consumed, might nudge a net of possibilities. That is not a burden reserved for a few. It is simply human stewardship writ small. The way you listen to a friend, the care you take with a child, the patience with a cashier. In the model the downloaded geometry offered, such small acts have amplified effects when conditions align. I still do not know who left the mirror or why the artifacts chose the margins they did. I will probably never know. The observers remained unnamed and the mechanism unresolved. What I do know is this: the timestamp, March 14th, 2026, 0347. GMT was not a command. It was a place on a map where attention found a seam and, for a sliver of time, made a different kind of thing possible. The term convergence seemed apt, a narrowing of possibilities that invited choice. There is an ethical takeaway that I try to live by now, and it is both small and urgent. First, notice. Notice your inner state with a merciful curiosity. Second, hold steadiness where you can. 10 minutes of calm attention is not a miracle, but it is practice. Third, do not substitute inner work for medical or professional help when you need it. If your experiences become destabilizing, speak with a clinician. And fourth, remember that observers, if they exist, show rather than decide. The responsibility to choose remains ours. I have been asked more than once what I would tell someone who reads these words and feels frightened or excited. I would say, begin with small, everyday experiments in steadiness. Try the 2-minute pause before responding to a text. Notice how often you react out of a habit that is not yours. Practice presence in tiny ways. If you find the practice meaningful and want guidance, there are responsible forms of support that don't promise enlightenment, but do offer structured exercises and medical backup. If you want those resources, there is an ebook I wrote that gathers what we learned. Careful explanations of the hypotheses, ethical guidelines, and simple practices for cultivating steady attention. I also offer limited private sessions that pair guided presence exercises with safety protocols and referrals as needed. These resources are meant as tools, frameworks to help people explore presence responsibly, not as guarantees. If you choose to look for them, you'll find the link in the video description and the pinned comment. Use them wisely. Consult professionals when needed. The world after March 14th did not become a parable with neatly labeled morals. It became slightly more attentive in some quarters, alarmed in others, and mostly human in the way humans always are. Part stubbornness, part generosity, part denial, part courage. The artifacts continue to appear now and then, a Polaroid in a library book, a printout on a bench, an email that reads like someone whispering, "You resist a lot." Those messages are reminders. Resistance can be prudent, but it can also be a reflex that keeps possibility small. I keep the mirror folded in its case now. Sometimes I take it out to remind myself of a weird, fragile night when a handful of people chose to sit in attention and something shifted, just a little. I keep the Polaroid of the cup with ripples tucked into my notebook as a kind of talisman against taking facts for granted. I keep my daughter's small breath at night as a better bell than any instrument. If you are still here, and if any part of this story touches you, I offer a final invitation that is both practical and ethical. For the next 2 weeks, try this simple experiment. Each morning for 2 minutes, sit quietly and notice the breath. If you prefer eyes open, fix gently on a neutral point. Notice when your mind chases itself and, without judgment, return the attention to breath. Keep a one-line journal. What shifted, if anything, during the day? This is not a promise. It is a practice. Over time, it may change what you notice and, in small ways, the choices you make. I have spent my life listening for signals that matter. The Waveform stamped March 14, 2026, AU 347. GMT was one such signal for me, not because it handed me answers, but because it made the ethical burden of attention visible. The possibility of revolution is not a fireworks display, it's a change in how mass attention is held. If enough people choose to practice steadiness, and to act from a place that values responsibility over reflex, then the arc of history might tilt toward possibilities that preserve agency and care. If not, life goes on, and other conditions will shape outcomes in ways we cannot predict. No one gave us a savior that night. No one removed our responsibility. What we received, if I can put it so plainly, was a reminder. Attention is not neutral. It carries weight. Like all cares, it requires practice, humility, and the willingness to stay with discomfort when it arrives. A few days after the event, Sarah and I walked a familiar street and paused beneath the store's flickering sign. She put a hand on my arm and said simply, "We did not get everything right." I agreed. We never would. The thing that matters is that we try again and again to become the kind of people whose attention can be used for something that preserves rather than diminishes possibility. There is no neat ending to this. There is only ongoing work, experiments, dialogues, care protocols, and the small day-to-day choices that add up. If you want to explore those practices with materials I assembled, structured, cautious, and clinically informed, the ebook and private sessions are available via the links I mentioned. They are tools for those who want guidance. They are not promises of miracles. Thank you for listening. If this reached something in you, notice it. Name it. Hold it lightly and act with care. The future, as we now know in a more intimate way, is not a fixed line, but a clustering of possibilities. We are not powerless in relation to them. We are, in ways both humbling and hopeful, responsible.